Social Networks and Health 2022. My name is Jim Moody, and I'm glad you all could join us. I just turned on the recording. You should all get the funny little notice from Zoom telling you that it's there. Feel free to keep your cameras on or off as you prefer. That's perfectly fine. We have a number of folks on the call today who are going to be monitoring the chat room and making sure that we try to keep track of things. As more and more people show up, it's going to be harder for me to keep a sense of what's going on or who's there. So it's a little bit, these kind of things are a little bit touch and go sometimes. So if there's a, if there's something that you really want to get a hold of us or something, just, be persistent and don't be shy about jumping in if you want to. That's great. You should be able to either chat everyone or chat to people directly. So if there's something you need in particular from one of us, it's myself and Dana, Gabe and Leanne, I think are the RAs that I see on the call right now. We will highlight others as they show up. Again, I just shut off the share screen so I can't see all of the people already. Again, thanks for coming. Normally, this is a week-long intensive training session that we do here in Durham, and we meet in a big room and we sort of do the work together and all this kind of stuff, and that's not going to happen this week, obviously. So and in fact, what we're going to do is put an equivalent of about 2 weeks of work in the 2 days, and then have some fun substantive talk. So it's going to be a bit of a drinking from a fire hose, if you will. And part of that is because we figured that on Zoom, most of the time really should be spent answering questions and thinking about things sort of applied, as opposed to trying to do point and click, a GUI interface, sort of actually nuts and bolts type work. And so instead, we flipped everything. So all of the deep lectures and the how-to lectures and that kind of stuff are on the recordings, and we assume that you've watched them or are diligently planning to watch them and have a sense of what's going to happen. And so that's the setup that we've done today and for the rest of this week. And we will work our way through then, trying to figure out essentially largely Q&A as we go through the day. The plan for this next 3 days, today we're calling our Foundations Day. If you've already done a bunch of network analysis, most of this should be review. If you've never done it before, it's a chance to get your feet a little bit wet as to what kind of things happen here. I will give a little bit more sort of detail than you should probably expect from most of the things that are going to happen in the next 2 days, in the sense that I don't assume that you've watched all the videos in depth or done all the practice things, but I want to give you at least touch a little bit of the highlights and then open it up for questions. You'll notice that the schedule runs back to back. We're not actually going to do that. We will stop 5 to 10 minutes before the end of each session and then try to start on time for each session so that people who are coming and going can see where they're at. The main plan for this morning is to go through an overview of why social networks matter for health and what the basics are, the really basics are of how data is organized and what kind of metrics and things you do with social network analysis. So this is Social Network Analysis 101 for people who've never had it. We're then going to open it up and talk about some bigger sort of open problem questions. Those we could as easily have put at the end, but I wanted to sort of key off with this in the front as much to let you tell us what kinds of problems you really think need to be solved so we can help key in the rest of the discussions over the course of the next few days. Then we'll talk a bit about ego network analysis. I will probably end up leading that. I realized that I was lax in assigning a person to do that. So hopefully everyone will jump in on the DNEC team to help answer questions on how to do network analysis from a local standpoint. And then we're blessed to have Jimmy Adams from the University of Colorado, Denver, who has written a great new book on data collection to talk to us about the ethics of network analysis and network data collection. So we'll go up for that. Then we'll break for lunch and come back and do some data stuff and some stat stuff. And then the dessert at the end of the day is visualization. So that's the plan for where we're going to go. I'm going to stop the share for just a second here to open it up for any questions or comments before we jump in. Anybody have things like Maria has a question? No, that's my hand on your screen here, I guess. Anybody have questions or comments thus far, or things that they want us to say before we get going? Can everybody hear okay? All that kind of thing? All right, great. So without further ado, then I'm going to jump back into the presentation. Like I said, if you have any questions throughout, please send them in the chat first. It's probably going to be the simplest, and go ahead and do that, as we go, as the RAs will tell you if you ask them directly, or certainly behind my back. I'm going to tell you that as soon as I start talking, I probably don't stop talking. So you want to take every chance you can to get me interrupted once the ball gets rolling. So don't be shy. All right, so I always start network analysis theoretically, and I think that one of the things to keep in mind about network analysis is that it is fundamentally a sociologically, theoretically rich method. And so if you think about what Peter Blau says here, he argued that to speak of social life is to speak of the association between people, and for various and sundry ways. But what he's really saying is that to be a human critter, to be a person embedded in social life, means to be connected to others. And the thing about social network analysis is its purpose is to capture that connection in various ways and what those connections mean. It turns out that connections for social scientists and for living a social life are deeply rich, and there are lots of various ways that they work. And so we're going to talk about a lot of them over the course of the day, but I just want to put that key point in the back of your mind, that we're going to talk a lot today about methods. But fundamentally, methods are in service of theory. And what network analysis takes as its starting point is if you can theorize a way that people's connections affect them, you can probably measure it. And some of those measures are off the shelf, and we have them, and they've been around for 50 years. Others you might need to invent, and that's perfectly fine. But I think unlike, I don't know, latent class analysis or directed acyclic graphs or a bunch of sort of other methods you might take in a different sort of methods course, this isn't a blueprint that you layer over lots of different things. This is an approach to thinking about social analysis that gives you the freedom to be the thinker and the developer. And you should use the tools, the bits and pieces to build the thing you want to build. But sometimes you might need to create those tools yourself. And this is me giving you permission to do that. So there's nothing in this field. I mean, you can certainly do something wrong, but in many ways, if you're thoughtful and think carefully, much of what you can do is really up to you to do something that you think is reasonable and defensible. And we're going to show you how to get there. A good part of what that means is to be creative. And I think that one of the nice things about network analysis that we try to keep open for researchers is that it is a very creative field. And there's lots of opportunities for you to do things that wouldn't otherwise be done in different kinds of settings. Now, people have been working on network analysis a lot in the last 40 years. And this is just to give you a sense of a piece I put together a few years ago, looking at the number of papers with networks in the title or abstract compared to the number of papers with obesity, for example. And these are all and health. And so you can see that networks and health is really a big chunk of things. You might think that 5% of papers isn't much, but in fact, you can consider how big of issue obesity is in our health lexicon. It's about the same. So there's a lot of work being done. And this is a work, of course, that NIH and NSF have been paying attention to. There's a lot of people who are funding research on this problem, because we all recognize that the limits to a completely idiosyncratic, individualistic approach to understanding social life is thin. And so we want something a bit richer than that. Now, you'll see some of these kind of plots today. Those of you that read the presentation got some details on it, but for the purposes of right now, you can think of the intellectual world of health research as a landscape, right? And it's a big island, kind of like Australia, and on the northwest side, you have social aging and support. On the bottom right, of the sort of southeast, you got health policy systems. And this landscape is rugged. There's mountains and valleys and so forth, each defined by a topic that work happens in. And some of these peaks are really sort of well-defined research areas. So you think about the work on social networks and HIV, that's fundamentally diffusion and a link tracing kind of design world. And it's pretty well self-contained. As you can see it down there at the lower left in a nice peak all by itself. Adolescence and peer are on their side, but basically the social landscape of health research moves from an individual model on the left to an institutional model on the right. and it has to do with things that are primarily contagious on the south and things that are primarily about social support and social networks as an environmental context in the north. And so that kind of a division between east, west, north, and south defines this landscape. And what's important to note is this is like what social networks and health research study, there's this entire range of things. It's about 20,000 papers in this case at this point. This is about 10 years ago that I put this together. And you can see that there's lots of different sort of micro topics built into this. There's over 150 unique literatures that you could easily write a review paper entirely on the 25 papers that have studied this one particular problem. And that's what these little clusters are highlighting. What I also wanted to point out is that all of these things are drawing on many of the same kinds of models. So one of the classics in the field is Rogers' The Diffusion of Innovations. This work finds itself all over the landscape. So everybody reads and uses something like Rogers' work. Wasserman and Faust is the standard text that gets cited all over the place. Tom Valente is Rogers' probably most prolific student in recent years. And his work on health interventions has shown up entirely across this landscape. So there's lots of things that are really broad in the literature on social networks and health. And I encourage you to go and read this. It's a deep literature, and you could easily spend your entire career just explicating what people have found in this work. And I think that there is some really nice work being done on this. Nick Christakis actually has a new book that has come out that it helps sort of summarize a lot of this work, and I encourage you to go out and get that. But it really is a rich field. And so if you're just starting on your journey in social networks and health, welcome. There's a lot here to be done, and I think you'll have a lot of fun. That's really all I'm going to do today on the introduction to what kinds of problems social networks and health deal with in terms of what literature has been done. You're going to see a lot more in terms of examples as we go, but the rest of the day is largely going to be on methods and how to and why, as opposed to what people have found. So if you have a particular question about one of these areas, please by all means jump in and let us know. All right. So we've been talking sort of briefly then about sort of broadly about social networks and health. Well, what do we really mean about the way this research works? And this is a sketch of what the research process looks like in the social networks and health space. You start with a research question. Say you want to know whether or not peers affect each other's health behaviors. And that leads you to some kind of data collection. Data collection leads to, once you have data, you have to do something with it. And then that's scoring, exploration, and modeling. And that gives you some kind of a result. So this green path that goes through the middle there is sort of the big picture path that occurs with any kind of research project, right? For network analysis, what each of these steps involves is a series of practical things that you need to do that have to do with data management, data cleaning. In the exploration stage, you might have the data visualization. In the scoring stage, you might care about things like centrality or homophily. In the modeling stage, there's some very particular network models that are there. All of these blue bits are the things we're going to help teach you over the course of the next 3 days. And so each of these, again, we could devote a whole day to each of them. So this really is, go and do the videos and look them up and these kinds of things. But what we want to do here is help answer questions and get you to see what the kind of things are that people are doing. Does this make sense? Feel free to jump in. Again, stop me if I'm going too fast or something doesn't make sense. And I apologize, but of course, because we're on Zoom and we're at home, someone's out making a bunch of noise in the yard. So sorry for the background noise. So how do we think about networks in health? I think it's nice to think about networks in health in the way you might think about anything in health. And so if you think about the kinds of questions we typically ask, we want to know like what causes health or what does health do to a problem. So health is either an outcome of interest that we're trying to essentially make better, or we're trying to figure out what the knock-on effects of health conditions are. So it can be a dependent variable or an independent variable. And networks are just like aspirin, if you will. So there's something about the network that affects a person's likelihood of getting a heart attack. And if they take a baby aspirin every day, maybe that'll stop them from getting a heart attack. Well, if they have good social support, maybe that'll prevent them from getting a heart attack. On the other hand, if they're already in pain, maybe it's the case that giving an aspirin will alleviate that pain, or it ends up being the case that if you're already having health issues, that being embedded in a network of people who are supporting and can care for you might make those health issues less problematic. So I want you to think about networks in many ways as just like any other health medicine. The difference is that it's also where you live, who you work with, who you play with, how you make sense of your social identity. So networks are all of these things simultaneously, but they're also useful for thinking about health. And so what you need to do is ask yourself, how can this context of my life, this thing that I'm doing every day with the people I engage with and how I work with them, how does that affect how I behave? And then as I behave, how does that affect what I do? Now, I put this in the singular, of course, because as Westerners, we often think in the singular, but in fact, what's nice about networks is that they are a way of linking individuals to collectives. And so that's part of what we really want to focus on, is how these networks work as an emergent property to understand collective effects in ways that are really hard to understand individual effects. This is going to become painfully clear when you start really thinking deeply about diffusion. Diffusion is a relational problem, and the thing at most interest is the transmission that goes on between people. So the stuff at the individual level is much less interesting than the stuff that goes on between all the individuals. And so that's just the simplest example of the ways in which networks are really about emergence through collectives as opposed to individuals, but are simultaneously about individuals being embedded in these sets. So there's this dualism of individuals and networks, or people and collectives, that I think is useful to keep in mind as you think about how networks matters. When I say this, then, it's sort of all a big preamble to these elements, which is that as a big broad stroke, researchers tend to think about networks as variables or networks as structures. What I mean by networks as variables is that we tend to take this big collective emergent property data object and we boil it down to a set of metrics. And those metrics we then use as an independent or a dependent variable. This is the most familiar way, I think, for sociologists and social health researchers to use network analysis. And so we're going to spend a good deal of time talking about it. It comes with some problems because we're hijacking a method that doesn't really fit, but it's doable, it's understandable, and it's there, and it's easy to get your head around. There's also a network as structured approach, which is probably more familiar to the ethnographers in the room or to the structural anthropologist types who are used to thinking about social systems as an intersection of behaviors, norms, and rules that collectively generate outcomes. And so you think about things like structural racism or the structural of the economy or these kinds of gender structure. That's what I mean here. The networks are big collective features that hold simultaneously a pattern of people connected to each other, but also imbued with that are sets of rules and common behaviors and expectations that generate the next iteration of that network. And so they're self-propelling structures in the Sewell type sense, where networks generate hierarchy and they generate segregation by virtue of the way they're developed. And that has implications for health. So if you're in a segregated network where people of different resources are in different social worlds, you see the kinds of problems that are related to health and health provision very differently. If a community understands itself as embedded in a community of others who are also at high risk to their kinds of health outcomes, that highlights the ability for them to engage in collective action and thus mobilize the network to be beneficial for our health outcomes. So this idea of networks as structures is that networks are really thought of as collective sort of social process generating units. And this is a much harder way to capture and requires a bit of that ethnographic or community studies kind of flavor. So that said, how do we actually get to these points? Well, I like to think about either the structural approach or the variable approach as having two fundamental ways of thinking about networks. One is what we call a connectionist approach, and the other we call a positional approach. A connectionist approach is networks as pipes. So what the network does is that there's something flowing through it. It could be knowledge, it could be a disease, it could be resources. But what matters and why we care about the network is that whatever is flowing through that network is the thing that we want to be able to capture. We want to figure out whether or not our pipes are wide or whether they're constricted or whether or not there's a hub in the middle that goes to every place. But these are the kinds of things that we think about in terms of network as connections. And I suspect that most of us, when we intuitively think about networks, this is what we think about, is that the network as pipes analogy gets us to echo chambers, it gets us to health support, because it's to disease diffusion, and that is where the majority of social network research has been done. The other sort of branch of network research is what I refer to as positional, or networks as roles. And the idea here is that networks are composed of repeated patterns that then aggregate into whole systems. And so the clearest example of the positional approach are kinship networks. And so you can think about, for example, how grandparents are always somebody's mother's mother, right? And so you end up with this notion of grandparents as a two-step network of descent. So somebody's child's mother's mother is a grandmother or maternal grandmother. And those kinds of kinship rules define the position of being a grandmother or being an aunt or being an uncle. And these kinds of positions then carry with them expectations. So we expect that uncles will behave differently than cousins, and we expect that uncles will behave differently than brothers. And that's because of the rules that are imbued in the relational generation. And that's also true for vice presidents, or for teachers and students, or for leaders and followers, or for core versus periphery. So there's lots of different kinds of positions that occur in networks, but these positions range from very formal things that have labels on them, like parents or like vice presidents, to very informal things like leaders in a classroom or something like this. But they have the same intuitive and theoretical power. They, by virtue of occupying that position, you are certain expectations that come with the role that people should follow through, either normatively or due to kind of separate local social sanctioning, this kind of thing. So that's a big picture approach of what networks are at. In the slides, I go through a couple more of these examples. It really just says the same things I just said there, a bit more than I wanted to. I think that the last thing to keep in mind is that I've made this distinction between connectionist and positional probably a bit strong, just to make the point. One of my favorite papers in this whole literature is Bernice Pesca-Solido's ASR from 2000, when she really points out that what makes the modernist, in terms of not traditional, but a modern sort of industrial nation identity set, is the intersection of these two pieces. That the connectionist element is where we learn things and who we talk to, but that ultimately defines the role. So what an individual is the intersection of these social circles and the ways in which they can draw from different connections, and that then helps inform their positional aspects. So these two things, again, this is going to come up throughout the day, are duals of each other. So a position and a connection are two sides of the same network coin. Okay? So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions before we get on to the data bits there. So I'm going to stop my share if I can. I forget how to do that. There we are. All right. Where should we? So I want to open it up here for a minute or two before we go into some of the basic data elements, just to give us a because like I said, once I start talking, I don't stop. So questions or comments on the big theoretical questions of the day so far? Anyone?
Jim, there was a question in the chat where some of the participants weren't sure which Christakis book you might have been referencing, if you know off the top of your head.
Yeah, it's Apollo's Arrow is the name of the book. It's his most recent book that just came out. It's a great book. I mean, people criticize Christakis a lot, but he's done a lot of good for the field of social networks and health, and I'm a fan. So I encourage you to read his stuff. The book I'm waiting for is on the Honduran Village Project, which is just remarkable. And unfortunately, a lot of that work isn't out yet, but it's like the data are just remarkable. So,
in my biased opinion, I agree.
Maggie has done a little bit of work on that stuff. So
yeah.
All right. Anything else then? Before I'll go ahead and just jump into some of the data things. I do think that I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record. I'm going to always say the answer to most questions is that it's a theory question, and most methods questions are actually theory questions in disguise. So you might get tired of hearing me say that. But I'm going to start with a little bit of basic method stuff, just in terms of the way data are organized. and probably go on for another few minutes and then stop and take some more questions. Comments, concerns? Everyone have coffee? All right, okay. All right, off we go then. So let me get this going here. All right. So what I want to talk about a little bit right now is just zoom in. This is part 2 of the large on the videos. We break this whole intro session into it really is a 4-hour, half of a day thing that we're condensing down to less than an hour. But what I want to talk right now is just make sure we're all on the same page about what network data look like and what some of the basic metrics are, because we're essentially going to assume these things as we move forward for the rest of the day. Okay. Get my thing to work. So networks are fundamentally the intersection of points and lines. And so there are 2 kinds of data here. And so the data are, whoa, wrong direction. The data are, on the one hand, a basic rectangular data set where each person is a row and each variable is a column. If you've ever done anything in quantitative social analysis, this is the data set you've played with, right? And so each row is an individual, each column is a variable about that individual. People are, in that sense, the intersection of their qualities. And so you will have race, age, gender, what have you, whether they smoke or not, as a column. And then for that differs for each person. And you can think about rows and columns. So rows are case studies and columns are variables. And that's sort of how we associate things usually, are to say, is this column correlated with that column? That's the standard data set on nodes. And network analysis takes that and adds to it a second data set, which is the relations. And these are sometimes referred to as edges, as arcs, as lines. I will be inconsistent just because I am, but I will usually refer to edges as undirected connections and arcs as directed, or otherwise I'll speak about ties as the generic sense. Now, networks can take a lot of flavor. Different flavors, if you will. And the main thing that makes a system, or that node data set is linked to that edge data set by virtue of connection. So that's what it's saying. And so the edges are sets of nodes that are linked together. And that can be linked in a way that is either undirected or directed. And what do we mean by that? So an undirected relation means there's no distinction between a sender of the relation and a receiver of the relation. Instead, we share the relation. And so if you think about some things that are necessarily symmetric, that are relevant for health would be something like sexual behavior. So sex is something that if I do it with you, you've done it with me. That's the definition of sex. So the fact that we share in a sexual relation means that the relationship itself must be undirected. Instead, if we had something like, lends money to, or tells a secret to, that would be directed. And so if I tell a secret to you, you might not tell a secret to me. If I trust you, you might not trust me. And so that kind of directed relation implies that the flow of information that might go through that network is going to also be governed by the pattern of those ties. Now, in some cases, that directionality is itself meaningful. So if it's passing of a disease, for example, that I pass a disease to you, then that direction means it's only going to continue going in that direction. So you could give a disease to somebody else, you can't give it back to me. So it's possible, if the relationship is directed, for those arcs to accumulate in a meaningful way. Oftentimes we ask questions about things that are probably usually sort of thought to be symmetric relationship, but we get asymmetric answers. So for example, if I ask you who your best friends are, you might name somebody who doesn't in turn name you as their best friend. So then as an analyst, you have to decide, is that directionality real? Is it meaningful for the social process I care about, or is it not? And sometimes it will be, and sometimes it won't. So it'll depend on your question. So the 2 columns in this little visual 2x2 here are directed versus undirected. The rows have to do with binary versus value. So lots of things that we deal with are binary relations. And in some sense, this is a mathematical convenience. It's just simpler to deal with binary graphs. So they're the easiest kind of data that's out there. And other times, it's the case that it really is just true. So if we have something like, went to school together, if we worked together, that could be just an on or off. We did or we didn't. And in contrast, there are other features that are valued, which is how often we do things together. So it might be that we worked together for 10 years versus we worked together for a day, or we were both in a group of 2 people versus we were in a group of 10 people. And so the value of the relation captures this. Valued relations are tricky. They make a lot of sense sociologically, we understand them, but it turns out that the different disciplines that have contributed to understanding and modeling these things that are called graphs in mathematical graph theory language use the weights very differently. So there's an entire discipline of people that put the weights to mean distances. And these have to do with how hard it is to get from one point to another. If you use Google Maps today to figure out where you wanted to go, then you've used that. That's what's under the hood. But in that case, they treat the value as something like the number of miles from one person to another, right? Or from one town to the other. Whereas in sociology, we tend to use the value to be how close we are. So I either like you a little or I like you a lot. I spend a little time with you or a lot of time with you. Now, theoretically, we can deal with that any way we want. We can just reverse them, or we can take the inverse or whatever. So we can make sure that the edge means what we want it to do. But the thing you have to be aware of is that the program under the hood have often been written by people with a bias towards how they assume it's going to be used. And that might not be the same way you think it's going to be used. So for about half of the routines in iGraph, in R, for example, treat the value of a tie as a distance, whereas in other features, they treat it as a closeness of the frequency. So you just need to be aware of that to understand what's there. Finally, we can think about networks. All of these pictures, you'll notice the edges are all the same color. That's indicating that it's a single relation. We don't specify what it is, but it's just one relation that creates the network. In fact, of course, social life is multiplex. There are often lots of different relations that overlay each other. And so it could be that we are friends and coworkers and kin, for example. And it might be that I trust somebody, but I also dislike them in other ones. So you can have relationships that are seemingly contradictory that go together over the same set. This is what we mean when we say that social life is rich and deeply embedded. There are lots of relationships going on simultaneously. Methodologically, we can deal with these. We have lots of tools for dealing with multi-relations. We don't typically have a lot of multi-relational data. It ends up being really complicated to collect network data, particularly at the whole system level. And so we often collect our data that looks like this on a single relation, even though we know, in fact, the underlying relationship looks somewhere like this. And so if you imagine who people's friends are in high school, those friendship relations have lots of different meanings associated with them. And those meanings affect how people are going to behave with respect to their people they're connected to versus not. And we've boiled that down perhaps to just a binary indicator, like or dislike. And so a lot of work that we do in network analysis is to take that thin version of the network that we have here and try to infer something richer from it, which we could easily get if we had multi-relational data based on some kind of pattern. So for example, if we look at a transitive tie, that a friend of a friend is a friend, that probably means the underlying relationship is richer and closer and deeper than if the friends of a friend are not friends. In that case, it might be more of an acquaintanceship relation. So you're going to see that pop up a lot. And there's a lot of play between the pattern of ties and the content of relations that we try to infer, because we can't have often as rich a data set as we'd like. Questions or comments on types of relations? All right, so let's talk about levels of analysis. So when we talk about networks as systems, it turns out there are lots of different levels of systems you can play with. And so the simplest idea is to think about a single relationship. So you might have a best friend dyad, and psychologists have spent years studying the best friend dyad. It was the staple sort of studied object in developmental psychology from about the 1960s to the early mid 70s. People were really focused on what was the content of that friendship relationship and how did that relationship affect who we are. And there's a lot of work that came out in the early 90s sort of building on that had to do with how people had a friend. What you wanted to do is, the main distinction was, do you have a friend or not? And then can you trust that friend? And so that kind of intimacy literature is all about the best friend dyad. We can then extend from that, right, to what's known as an ego network. And we'll talk more in depth about ego networks here after this session. But the main question for ego networks are that a lot of problems we care about, particularly in the health world, aren't really system level questions. They really are context questions. And we want to ask how an individual's context at one point differs from their context in another. And just as we can think about physical neighborhoods and geographic neighborhoods, we can think about network neighborhoods. And the network neighborhood is an individual and all the relations that radiate out from them. Now, I'm deliberately saying they radiate out from them because it might be, as that circle is drawn here, they radiate one step, but they could just as easily radiate two. And so you might say that my social context, the relevant social context for my behavior, is all the people I'm directly connected to or indirectly connected to. And that, by two steps. That's a pretty broad social swath. It's probably thousands of people. And so we might want to think about, like, how do we drill down to that, to the most salient people. But ego networks, there's a lot of advantages to ego networks. Most of this next 2 days will not focus on ego networks, only not because they aren't important, but because much of the sort of tools we've developed for understanding social networks have dealt with the complexities that come with global networks or sociocentric networks. Global networks have some advantages that we'll talk to in terms of particular kinds of questions, but if your question is fundamentally an individual embedded in a context, you might think about whether or not you can get away with an ego network design, because that tends to be much easier to analyze. It's not necessarily easier to collect from a data standpoint, but it's definitely easier to analyze. Once you get past this individual-centered notion of a network, then you have a lot of range of things that fall into this broad category of partial networks. And so the partial network could be the primary social group that a kid belongs to or a person belongs to. This could be their peer group. It's been called in sociology a cohesive subgroup. It's been called in the network science world a community. Either way, it's a collection of people that you spend most of your time with. It doesn't mean that you don't also have ties outside of that primary group. And so I can be a member of a primary group and still have some context with people on the outside. So here our central red node is most deeply tied to this group on the right, but has some ties to others. Then you have sort of other sets of networks that sort of move itself out, and you have the global network. And oftentimes what we're going to talk about in this class is the global network. The sociocentric network takes a bird's eye view of the social system and asks how the patterns of connection in one social system differ from the patterns of connection in another, and how might a node's position within this setting affect their behaviors in various ways. Part of the advantages of global networks is that it's possible to see how things diffuse through a network. So if you want to understand the spread of COVID, for example, you really would like to have some kind of a working model for how likely a person is to cough on another person. And so in order to get that, we have to understand what parts of the network are really densely packed together with lots of opportunities for transmission, and which parts are far apart and have unlikely transmission potential. Being able to distinguish that is the key advantage of a global network model. You can see the entire landscape and ask these questions about diffusion and about role positions that you just can't ask with a limited local network. But it comes at a cost. And there are probably two of the biggest costs from this are that the method assumes you have a census of the population. Right, so the idea is of a global network is that you actually have the global network. You don't actually have the global network, right? So we have an assumption and we violate it the first minute we step out to look at real data. So the people who brag about networks are always saying, like all you other statisticians out there are, throwing away connectivity, you're assuming independence, that's a false assumption. And the retort to that is, yeah, well, you assume you have the network and you never do. Right, so I think that these two things, you always make the trade-offs in analytic approaches. The main trade-off we make for global networks is this boundary question is, where is the relevant boundary for the research question? And this is known as the boundary specification problem. There's a rich literature on boundary specification. The main sort of way we deal with it sort of falls into two camps. One is what we call a realist camp. And in that version, what you do is you let the data tell you where the boundary is. And this is typically done with snowball samples or other kinds of link tracing designs, where you keep tracing out so long as you're getting new people. But as soon as you start getting into the same people over again, you've assumed you've exhausted the universe of relevant people for whatever that is. So for example, if you want to study, jazz musicians in New York, you ask jazz musicians who they play with, pretty soon you're going to come up with a relatively cohesive set of folks who often play together. And that would be, the community of jazz musicians in New York. And that's a good place to understand the spread of illicit drugs in the 70s. This is a real study that was done a while ago, quite a while ago. I'm aging myself. A nominalist boundary says, I don't know what the real relations do, but I have a boundary that the name on it that I can specify, right? And so I might, for example, say Lincoln High School, or downtown Durham, or Duke University. And so by having a thing that I can put a boundary around, then I can circumscribe relations and say, I'm going to study the things that are going on within that boundary. Now, if you're smart, you're going to ask yourself the question, like, how often do my relations that I care about cross that boundary? That is, once I have a nominalist boundary, I can ask whether it's any good or not, right? So I can actually ask my respondents to tell me whether or not the relationships go outside that boundary or not. And that will help bound the claims you make about what's going on within the network. But most of the time, this is a pretty, the way we do research. We define the boundary ex ante, and then we go in and look for relationships within that boundary. Ideally, you've done that in this way that is smart. And so that boundary actually captures most of the relations. If you're dealing with something like adolescence, schools are a pretty good boundary. Most kids go to high schools or junior highs, most adolescents that is, and most of their friends are in the same school that they go to. Now, not always, like some kids have neighborhoods that they go to different schools than where they live, and they have neighbors that are friends and so forth. But the vast majority of kids' friends are in the schools they're in, because schools are total institutions. We take kids there at 7 o'clock in the morning, we keep them there till 3:30, let them out, and then we keep them for extracurriculars. And so we lock their butts in a seat for 8 to 10 hours a day, and they're going to make friends with the people they're with, right? And so this is a good boundary for that set. On the other hand, for modern American adults, it's not clear that work is the best boundary for them, particularly if they're involved in churches or clubs or political activities. Work is one boundary, but it deeply intersects these other boundaries. And so being able to make sense of whether or not your workplace is a good nominalist boundary for data collection is going to depend on the kind of question you have. So this harkens back to why I think Christakis's work on the Honduran village case is so wonderful, because the one way to get rid of the boundary problem is to just collect data on everybody, right? So go into a village and say, I'm just going to sample everybody. Manoj Mahanan here in our Duke Policy School has done the same thing in India on 81 villages in Uttar Pradesh. And so these kinds of studies where you can go into, and there's a whole host of studies that have been done in Malawi on the same kind of project. And so what is so wonderful about those projects are that they allow us to do for adults what schools do for adolescents. That is, for adults in these village contexts, the village really is a pretty good boundary, and you just go in and get everybody. For modern industrialized adults living in Western nations, it's much harder to find those kinds of totalizing boundaries that capture all of your relations. Part of what makes us moderns is that our relations cross-cut these boundaries, and it's difficult to sample 380 million people. So that was a bit more than I went off a bit more on boundary classification than I wanted to, but I just want to, it really is like the fundamental assumption of what everything else that you do is applying to that. So classic data collection rule of garbage in, garbage out is your boundary has to be meaningful for your total network to be reasonable. All right, so the second way, so we now have the levels of analysis, we have types of relations. Then I want to talk about types of connectivity, and the language here that people use is one mode versus two mode. And so a one mode network is a network that you tend to think of, which is who's friends with who works with who like shares a secret with who, these kinds of things. These are direct connections between people of fundamentally the same type. And in theory, each person could connect to any other person. In a two-mode network, there are two types of nodes in the network, and people can only connect across the type. So you might have authors and papers. You might have workers and workplaces. You might have travelers and buses, right? And so people connect to each other by virtue of sharing the other object. And so that's why it's called two-mode. And so the classic example is a bunch of women in the South who went to lunch with each other. So these are, women who lunch, and these are high society women in the 1920s, if I remember correctly. And so you end up that you don't have a direct connection. The data weren't collected, or you don't know if Flora actually talked to Olivia, but they went to lunch at time 11 together. And so they probably talked to each other. And so it's an indirect connection. The beauty of these kinds of two-mode networks is that they are everywhere, right? And so if you have anything that a person does with another person, you have a chance to create a network. And it can often be a really good proxy for things like communication or sharing or being exposed to similar ideas or something like that. So I really encourage you to be creative and think about where you see these types of things. And in particular, it's easy to see a social network based around shared events. And this is the traditional way of doing this in sociology. But it's also possible to do connections through shared meaning items, such as books we've read, blogs we listen to, music we care about. So lots of cultural items can create a shared affinity, which is then be put into a network context. So my joke with my colleagues is that I'm a network imperialist. I can turn anything into a network, and this is why. Because if we share something, we are in fact overlapping in a network. And then all the tools that have been developed for networks, I can apply to cultural memes, or I can apply it to music tastes, or I can apply it to every answer you made on a survey in the last GSS, right? So it's possible to connect people by their shared responses to surveys, irrespective of what the question is. So I don't need to know what the question's about, but if I know you and I answered the same way on a dozen different questions, we're probably going to answer the same way on the next 24 questions. And so these ways of thinking about how people are connected are really deep and really rich and all over the place. And they're cheap to collect, right? These are the kind of data you can collect almost anywhere that you can find it. Finally, there's a version of the multiplex network or multi-mode network, which has become more prevalent in the last 5 years, called multi-layer networks. And what a multi-layer network is whereas a multiplex network is the same set of nodes with different kinds of relations, like friendship and work and kin. A multi-layer network is different types of nodes. So you might have airports and people, but you also have relations both within and between those layers. So it might be that airports, share resources about security or something, but they also share passengers. And so you have lots of different. What this allows you to do is to collect network systems of lots of different types of things simultaneously. This first came to the fore when people started thinking about the Internet of Things. And so you think about people on the internet connecting people with messages, but then it turns out they're also connected to their cameras and they're connected to their phones and so forth. And these things are connected to each other directly. And so you can have a layer for each kind of item, a person versus a machine. And you have different kinds of connections amongst machines than you do amongst people, but the two connect to each other. And once this mathematical formalism came to be, it turns out that it's a really rich way to collect lots of different sort of intersecting parts of social systems. And so it's a pretty exciting new way to think about networks. All right. In the slides, you're going to see the basic data structure, the way we collect and organize these data. It's intuitive and useful to think about this thing called an adjacency matrix. And so an adjacency matrix is this thing in the middle. This is an n by n array of each person and the people they could be connected to. The diagonal is usually meaningless. We don't care about whether we talk to ourselves, for example, but we care about who else we talk to. And so the adjacency matrix captures that information. And so here we can see that person C had relationships with person B, person D, and person E. In this case, it's a valued adjacency matrix, and that valued adjacency matrix is very simple. We just put the value in the cell. This is a useful thing to think about because once you have a matrix, you have matrix algebra, and all the tools that go with matrix algebra turns out to be very useful for understanding social network analysis. And so this is why we think about the adjacency matrix, is because it's a useful mathematical artifact. In fact, you're a fool to hold your data in an adjacency matrix because it's a giant object. And so we tend not to do that. Instead, we tend to hold our data in these things called adjacency lists or arc and edge lists. And these are just ways of capturing edges on a data set. The adjacency list format is the one you're probably familiar with because this is what comes out of every survey that's ever happened. You have a row for each person and a column for each relationship they have. It's a bit cumbersome to play with adjacency lists because if it's a value list, you have to have parallel corresponding variables. So you have one variable for the who and another variable for the value. So that ends up being a bit, you just have to make sure that you get the right variables with each other. Otherwise, you're going to put, you're going to have a missing data problem. So it's a bit cumbersome to get that matching right. But so long as you do that, it's a pretty concise way to hold the data. The other way is what's known as an arc list or an edge list. In this case, each row is a relationship, and you just indicate the players of that relationship as one node or the first node or the second node. In this particular example, it's a symmetric relationship, so it doesn't matter. And then you can have characteristics of the relationship for each column. So this is the most efficient way to hold network data is in an arc list or an edge list. The one risk with this is that you have to recognize that you can't hold isolates in an arc list, right? Unless you have some way of putting an ego to themselves. So you don't ever want to keep your data in just an arc list. You need to have an arc list and a node list if you have isolates. Otherwise, the isolates get lost. All right, so there's a bunch of other things that we can talk about in terms of metrics. I think that in the interest of making sure that we have time to get to some of the open problems and other things, I'm going to stop here. And well, I lied to you. I'm not going to stop. I'm going to say that there are two classes of metrics that you want to think about. There are networks, there are metrics that position a node within a network, and there are metrics that characterize the structure of the network. So the first one of those are broadly referred to as centrality scores, and there are, I'm going down here, I should have just said backwards, there are hundreds of centrality scores. The reason we think about centrality is because situating a person in the pattern of the network is the easiest way to do that theory link between a social process and a social structure. And so if I have a social process that I think has to do with powerful people getting what they want, then I can operationalize power as a person who's connected to other people who are also connected to lots of people. And that takes me to something called Eigenvector Centrality. And so you can go from a social process, power is the accumulation of social capital, to a social operationalization or network operationalization in Eigenvector Centrality. And that ends up being a very nice one-to-one match. And I have different versions of centrality that have to do with power that comes from separation, or power that has to come from closure, or power that comes from getting lots of information quickly. Each of these will have a different type of centrality measure, but all of them are fundamentally positioning a person within a pattern of ties. A second class of measures are all about the ways in which a network is connected as a whole. And that has to do with this thing called paths. A path in a network is, if you will, the strings that you could layer over all of those edges as they go through lots of the network. And depending on the pattern of those strings, you either have a really tight rope or you have a really fragile snag that's about to fall apart. And all of what occurs in the sort of lingo of network analysis is about counting these different types of paths, these different types of connections between people. And that's what gives us this notion of reachability. And so if we think about something like, or connectivity, if we think about something like a sex network, this is an adolescent sex network. In this case, there are lots of little fragments and one big connected set, but this connected set is really fragile, right? There are these long, thin chains, and there's not much reconnection. In contrast, we can imagine a network like this one, where you see this is a sex network in Colorado Springs from the 90s among commercial sex workers, and you see that commercial sex workers share lots of the same Johns, and so there's lots of these reconnected links. And so again, you think about these as threads in a rope, they're all sort of reinforcing each other as opposed to going through and tying onto a single node, and thus the whole thing is well held together. From a pipes standpoint, that means there's lots of things that can go through it. From a cohesiveness standpoint, the more of those threads that are sort of relinking independently, the harder it is to pull that thing apart, so the more cohesive it is. And all of the metrics we have on global cohesion and diffusion potential play on those two plays. All right, so that's the world's fastest introduction to social network metrics. I want to stop there for a bit, give us a chance to stand up and what have you before we come back to other kinds of open questions. So quick questions right now, otherwise we'll take a quick break for 5 minutes and come back with open problems.
One quick question was whether anyone has any good references for diffusion or normative influence.
Yeah, probably the best, I don't know if it's the best book, but the key foundation book there is Noah Friedkun's The Structure of Social Influence. The first version of it came out in the 90s. He redid it, I think, in the early 2000s, and he's had a bunch of papers on different sort of versions of his model. But the normative influence transmission process that Noah Friedkun plays out is sort of the starting spot that then goes off from there. Thanks, Gabe. Gabe put it in the chat. All right, take a couple of minutes, and we'll be back. It's essentially, please come with questions. Otherwise, I'll just start talking again. I'm here for a quick sort of open problem section. I do have, of course, I have a set of what I think are sort of the unsolved problems, and I'm happy to talk about those. But I would really rather hear what you guys are interested in. So take 5, and we'll be back. Let's start at like 11:02. We'll actually start talking.